Hello, this is Gabriela on the scene today with Talk Network Radio. We have a real treat for you just around the corner, and that is Empowered Living with Jeff Byrd. Jeff is the owner of Jeffrey Byrd Coaching, and he will be coming to you weekly to teach you more about empowered living. Now, let's join Jeff already in the studio.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeff Byrd with Jeffrey Byrd Coaching, and this is Empowered Living. I'm so glad that you joined us today because we've got a very special guest with us from the Southeastern Virginia chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. Please welcome Katie McDonough to the show. Katie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so Katie represents a situation and a diagnosis that affects millions of people around the world, and it's often very misunderstood. So we've invited Katie in today to share with us a little bit more about this disease that affects so many people, especially about compassion and understanding what's really going on from the patient's point of view who has this diagnosis, and then also compassion for those who provide care and the family members as well. So Katie, I'm going to turn the floor over to you and let you share with us some and give us some deeper insight and understanding into this disease, and especially what it's like to be someone who has it.
Sure. Well, I always like to start any conversation about Alzheimer's making sure that people understand the impact of the disease, because historically I think we've often thought about it as an old person's disease or something that just happens to us as we grow older, which is far from the case. Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease. It does destroy the brain. It affects 5.8 million Americans in this country who are currently diagnosed. And right now, there is no way to treat, prevent, or cure the disease. There are medications that are out on the market, and many of us hear about them. Those medications treat symptoms, but they don't do anything to reverse the actual disease process that's destroying the brain. So when you receive a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, it's, incredibly overwhelming because, because of those facts, because we understand that there are so many people who are affected and we really don't have a way to treat it. And so often what families are faced with is, I'm sorry, this is your diagnosis. Here's a medication that can help you with your symptoms. And really all we can do medically is to track your symptoms and we'll see you in 6 months. And really families are left with not knowing how to navigate that. At the same time, we have still in this country today an incredible stigma that surrounds the disease. And when we talk about compassion, whether that's a person who is living with Alzheimer's or a care partner or other family member, we have to start with stigma because I think our response with compassion really is a response that can actually help us eradicate stigma. And so often what we hear described by those who are living with the disease, when they learn that they're diagnosed and they start sharing that with other people, many times you see people retreat, friends and families retreat, or not understand how to respond, and then they make assumptions about the disease that, okay, now that there's a diagnosis, this person has completely changed.
Right, I understand.
And people often say that, their loved ones or their friends, make assumptions about them, forget that they're a person, automatically think that, you hear words like crazy or my judgment is completely gone, when really we know that this disease, because of the progression, it's very personal and it can progress sometimes quickly, but oftentimes very slowly over time. And so, particularly in the early stages of the disease, we see this experience of stigma affect the person living with the disease most. And so one of the things that we really try to do at the Alzheimer's Association, and I would say this is likely true of a lot more of those professionals working in dementia care these days, is to really come alongside people and give them a perspective of empowerment. That yes, we don't have a treatment yet, but there is hope for you, and we want to empower you to live the best life that you can, the most meaningful life, and you have a purpose in helping us end this disease. And we want to figure out what that purpose is for you, and we want to use it for our cause. Hope and
purpose. I like that.
Exactly. So this can take many forms for a lot of people. And on the very basic level, we want people to tell their story about the disease, about how they learned that they had the disease, what was going on before the diagnosis that made them concerned as an individual or their family members. And then what they are doing now with their lives to help participate in this movement to find a cure and to find an end to it. And so that story is so powerful because anytime we tell our stories, right? If we tell our stories, we own them. If we don't, if we hide them, they own us.
And they're not understood.
Correct. And I think the best way to get rid of stigma, going back to that whole concept of stigma, is to shine light on it, is to really shed light and to bring it to the surface, so that we can understand and we can connect with other people who are experiencing the same things that we are. So that's one way that we encourage that. The other way is to form community with other individuals with the disease and to do things together, to talk to one another, to form friendships, to have experiences in life together in spaces that they feel are safe around the disease. And lastly is to advocate, which it kind of goes hand in glove with telling your story. The Alzheimer's Association has done incredible work over the last 15 years in, for example, increasing the research funding through the National Institutes of Health for Alzheimer's research. And the primary way we did that was through those stories, through those advocates who were living with the disease and telling their story. So that's where I see that empowerment and that purpose coming. As those who are around individuals living with Alzheimer's, it's really reaching out through compassion to really understand their experience and understand the uniqueness of that experience, so that we can, as they move through the disease, we can be of help to them, not only in those practical day-to-day things, but to really help them kind of retain that sense of self, retain that sense of purpose, and to live the most independent life that they can as long as possible. So I see that's what we see with those who are living with a diagnosis. I think the other side to this really is the caregiver experience. And in the almost 15 years of work that I've done in aging and long-term care, the experience of being a caregiver, it is so often done in isolation, and it's so often done from a place of not feeling, really equipped, and so often where caregivers start in that process is they really aren't given the tools, even in some cases, a basic understanding of the disease. So, I think knowledge is power. So that's kind of where we start with caregivers. we want to make sure that they understand and are able to separate the disease from the person. And that is particularly important as individuals move through the middle and late stages of the disease, where we see more challenges with behaviors, when we see people needing more hands-on help that can potentially be threatening to the individual living with a diagnosis. And so what we want to do is, equip people with information, with knowledge, and with skill. And we do that through, a lot of workshops and giving folks the opportunity to learn those and then practice those skills. But one of the things I hear most often when we're kind of walking through scenarios or case studies is, well, that's not how it always turns out for me as a caregiver, right? When I'm in the moment, I don't always reach that outcome as easily as I did in this workshop, and that that can be for a lot of reasons. It can really a lot of variables could cause that, but and then sometimes what I'll hear from caregivers is it can include tears and it can include frustration, and it's just, kind of hopeless comments like, I try, but I fail, or I lose my patience and I can't do it right every time. And I think caregivers often put a lot of pressure on themselves, and a really unrealistic amount of pressure on themselves to be able to respond the right way every time.
Sure.
And that if they don't respond the right way every time, that they're putting the person at risk or they're causing the problem. And we often talk a lot about, that learning how to caregive for someone is kind of like building your toolkit or your toolbox. That you can put knowledge and you can put skill, but at the end of the day, you aren't in control all the time. And I think one of the concepts that we often think about, and I often have them walk through, is that the whole concept of self-compassion. That, the first thing that we need to do in order to be compassionate to others is to be compassionate to ourselves. And that compassion quite literally can come through what we think about ourselves, what we say to ourselves, and physically how we interact with our own self, And so we can practice the whole concept of self-compassion by kind of taking from a thought process and a verbal process, taking those thoughts and taking those things that, quite often we say under our breath to each other, oh, you're so stupid, or, oh, how could you do that? Things we would never imagine saying to another person, but we are more than happy and more than willing to say to ourselves. That's very much the experience of a caregiver. And so we really start with understanding that we want to change that, change that conversation so that we're intentionally saying to ourselves things like, that's okay. This is really hard.
Right.
You're not alone. It's hard for other people. And then moving that not only in thought, but verbally, and then also moving that into a space of like, even physically touching ourselves, like, holding our own hand.